Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, I also hope that you do subscribe. If you are a returning subscriber, I am so glad that you are here with us today. Be sure that you do subscribe if you have not already. And also there is a button down below where you can join a part of my subscription, where you're going to be part of a private chat group. And also all of my lives from here on forward will be for my subscription service. It's like $4 to join it, and there's emojis and all kinds of things. So a lot of fun going on over there. Today is episode number 3 of True Crime Thursdays. We have covered Jodi Arias and the murder of Travis Alexander. We have covered Gypsy Rose and the murder of her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard. And today we actually have a story that is incredible. It ends with that rainbow at the end that all of us hope and pray that any abduction ends in. Today we're going to tell the incredible story of Elizabeth Smart. We're going to talk about a little bit before the abduction, and the incredible light she shines through her life today. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into episode number 3, True Crime Thursdays, the story of Elizabeth Smart abduction.
Let's switch this up.
Elizabeth Ann Smart was born on November 3rd, 1987 in Salt Lake City, Utah. Parents, Edward, or Ed as we're going to refer to him in the rest of this, and Lois Smart. She had 4 other brothers and 1 sister, and she had an incredible life. They were very wealthy. They lived in a beautiful home in Salt Lake City, Utah, and they had that picture perfect life. Like when you imagine like that picture perfect childhood, the picture perfect home, the picture perfect husband, wife, that was what the Smart family were. They were part of the community. They were pillars in the community. They were part of the Mormon church, which we have spoken about before on True Crime Thursdays with the Jodi Arias, Travis Alexander case. The Mormon church and the Book of Mormon has a lot of different beliefs and a lot of different things that the Book of Mormon holds. There's the law of chastity, which we've spoke about, which is no sex before marriage, but there are other things. And the Smart family were very heavily involved in the Church of Latter-day Saints. This beautiful home that the Smart family lived in, Ed would hire contractors frequently to work on the home, different parts of the house, whether it be the windows or painting or the roof. And in fall of 2001, the Smart family is out and about in Salt Lake City, and they're shoe shopping. It's the mother and the kids, and they're shoe shopping for the boys. And one of the boys walks across the street to this shoe shop and is going to go buy a pair of shoes. And on his way over, the mom and the 2 girls, which would be Elizabeth, she would be the oldest one, and then there would be Mary Catherine, she was younger. They would be following shortly behind the brothers, and this homeless man stops the boys and asks if they have any money to spare. The boys say, no, we don't, but the mother, like I said, is very closely behind them, and she would give this man money. She would give him a $5 bill. She starts to have a conversation with this man. We would learn that this would be Brian Mitchell. Now, Brian Mitchell would talk about how he was also involved in the Mormon faith and that he was a born-again Christian, and just spilling all of this stuff to Lois. And she informed him that her husband, Ed, would hire people to private contract, like do odds and ends around their home. And that is when she would give Brian Mitchell Ed Smart's phone number. And shortly after that, in the fall of 2001, Ed would have Brian Mitchell over to their home to work on the roof. Would do a lot of gabbing when it came to his one and only day working at the Smart's residence. He would tell Ed that he was a born-again Christian and that, he was heavily involved in the Mormon faith, and et cetera, et cetera. He would lay it on thick. And, Ed while he said he felt sorry for Brian and wanted to help him in any way that he could, so he had hired him to come back the next day, but Brian Mitchell would never return back to the Smart home to work anyways. Another very interesting fact in this case is that Brian Mitchell never informed Lois or Ed that his name was Brian Mitchell. In fact, he had told them that he wanted to be called Emmanuel. And this was like his whole persona to the Smart family. And it would carry on further. And we'll get into Brian Mitchell and his background in just a minute. But just keep in mind, upon meeting the Smarts, they knew him as Emmanuel. They did not know him as Brian Mitchell. On June 4th, 2002, the Smart family had been to the funeral of Elizabeth Smart's grandfather. He had been diagnosed with cancer, and it was a rapid speed cancer. He only lived a couple of short months after he was diagnosed with cancer. So it had been a really, really, really rough day for the family. They had came home, and Lois Smart had even burnt the potatoes that she was cooking, and she had cracked the kitchen window because she had burnt the food. And there was just a lot going on, a lot of emotions. They were very, very close with their grandfather. And so that night, that whole day was a rough day. They had been to a funeral, a lot was going on. There was a lot of emotions going through the home. And every night they had a routine of the kids going up to bed. Their parents would tuck them in, they would say their prayers, and they would go to bed. Early mornings of June 5th, 2002, Elizabeth Smart would be woken from her sleep with a man standing in front of her, over her, at her bed, and he had a knife pressed against her neck. Elizabeth Smart and Mary Catherine, they shared a bed together. So initially when Elizabeth wakes up to a knife being pressed against her neck and this man standing over her, she has reportedly said that initially she thought that she was having a nightmare, which is probably a form of panic and like being in such shock that this is actually happening. I couldn't imagine what that would be like at 14, which was the age of Elizabeth at the time of her abduction. I couldn't imagine what that would actually be like. Also, keep in mind that Mary Catherine was only 9 years old at the time of Elizabeth's abduction, so keep all of this in mind. She wakes up and she hears this voice say, "If you make a sound, if you do anything other than what I tell you to do, I'm going to kill you, and then I'm going to kill your entire family. I'm going to kill your baby sister, I'm going to kill your mom and dad, and your brothers. If you make a peep, if you do anything other than what I'm telling you to do." So beside of her is Mary Catherine, her 9-year-old little sister. And Mary Catherine has now said that she was actually awake when this abduction happened. And Mitchell thought that Mary Catherine was asleep, but she wasn't. She was awake. And she was listening to every word that was being said. It was dark. Brian Mitchell would lead Elizabeth Smart over to her closet where he would have her put on her shoes. She was in her pajamas, and Mary Catherine has said now that the house was very creaky, and she just remembers being extremely terrified. And at one point she stopped, like you could kind of tell where they were in the house depending on the creaks that you would hear. And she said at one point she had figured that they were downstairs. And so she remembers getting up out of bed and starting to run to her parents' room, and she heard them, and she ran back and got under the covers and hid in the bed. And she waited just a little while longer until it was complete silence, and she ran into her parents' room and woke them up and said that someone had taken Elizabeth out of the bed. Upon Brian Mitchell coming into the home, it would later be found that he actually sliced the screen of the window that Lois Smart had left cracked. That window was never shut after she opened it from burning the food. He sliced that screen and came right into the house. Now, it would be later found that the day that he came to contract that home, he had studied every window in the house, and he had already had his eyes on Elizabeth. Like that was like he had chosen Elizabeth prior to breaking into the home. And we'll get into that in a moment, held a knife to her back, and again kept repeating to her, if you make a peep, if you do anything other than what I'm telling you to do, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill your whole family. So he has a knife pressed up against her back, and he leads her out of the house and up into the mountains around Elizabeth Smart's home. Matter of fact, Elizabeth would not only be recovered miles away from her home, but for a larger portion of her abduction, she would be just miles from her home in the woods. Automatically, once Lois and Ed Smart learn of their daughter's abduction, they're calling police, family, everything to come over to the home and to figure out where their daughter is. However, this was the graveyard shift. And typically graveyard shift does have a lot of the rookie police officers, and none of them had handled a situation like this before. Also, keep in mind, this year was the year that the United States was holding the Olympics, and it just so happened to be in Salt Lake City. So it was a very high touristed area at the time, and the police that were on at the time of this abduction were not prepared for it. They weren't even roping off crime scenes. They were letting people come in and out of the house. They weren't logging people who were coming in and out of the house. Like, it just wasn't the look. And once actual police officers who, knew what to do got there, they were like, what the hell? You've completely ruined the crime scene. People have been walking in and out of here like it's nothing. Like, what the hell have you done? Important thing to remember through all of this is how smart Elizabeth Smart was. Elizabeth has said many times the reason that I was rescued was because of me. And I wholeheartedly believe that. This little girl was so smart, and she was very witty, and another important thing to mention is once Elizabeth gets to the campsite of where she was going to be held for a while anyways, she realizes that there is another person there. This other person would be a woman by the name of Wanda Barzee, which was actually married to Brian Mitchell. However, Elizabeth, upon originally being introduced to Wanda and seeing Wanda, I don't think there was any type of cordial introduction or anything, but I think that she thought that Wanda was there against her will. Very soon she would realize that Wanda was actually a part of this, and that Wanda knew exactly what she was doing and what was going on. Brian Mitchell was telling Elizabeth Smart that he was a chosen prophet, chosen by God, and his name was Emmanuel, and he was there to, fight through the last of times. And Elizabeth was called through Emmanuel by God so that she could really see what life, like, she had to endure these things. They were tasks. And part of her tasks was to become Emmanuel's wife. She was 14 years old. She's been raised in the Mormon faith. She has had a very, very good life, and all of a sudden, she is now being told that it is her lifely duty to be married to this old man, and that she's going to be married to him. He is a prophet, and, she's going to have sex with him and all of these things. Now, Brian Mitchell would chain Elizabeth Smart up, where she would be chained for a long time. She would be chained up. He would starve her for days, go without water for days. And for the first little while, Elizabeth was really trying to play on your side type of card. She would say, you're going to get caught. You're going to get in a lot of trouble. I know if you just take me back right now, my parents aren't going to do anything to you if you just go ahead and take me back. But Brian Mitchell wasn't having it. He was like, no, this is your life now. You need to forget about your old life. And he would continuously beat that into Elizabeth's head that, her old life was the past. This is the present, and she needs to live in the present. She needs to take on her wifely duty. Another important part of this case is that Brian Mitchell, Wanda Barzee, would train Elizabeth to speak in Bible type language. So it would be like thou and thy and all of these things. And you got to remember, Elizabeth was abducted for 9 months. So there was some kind of brainwashing that probably took place between this time. And Elizabeth said she just remembers just being so terrified and so scared that any time that she would, find a time to maybe like run or yell. She remembers one time where her family was running searches for Elizabeth in the woods by their home. And she remembers hearing her Uncle David's voice in the woods. And she just remembers like thinking, oh my God, he's like right there. And Brian Mitchell tells her, if you make a peep, if you yell, I'm going to kill you, and then I'm going to go kill your whole family. And you have to remember, this is a 14-year-old girl, so of course she's scared to death that either they're not going to believe that she's Elizabeth and she's going to be kept with them, or that they're going to get away somehow and come and kill her family in the middle of the night. So she remained quiet, and they never came up on their campsite. Very soon after Elizabeth's abduction, Brian Mitchell then marries him and her to one another. That's what he tells Elizabeth, that they're now married. He is now her husband, she is his wife, and says that they are now going to consummate the marriage. And Elizabeth not only would be starved for 9 months, beaten for 9 months, gone without water for 9 months, but she would also be continuously raped for 9 months. Not only that, but when Brian would leave the woods to go to town, he would be going to get money for food or what have you. A lot of the times Elizabeth would say that he would come back with just booze, just like wine or liquor. And she said that after a period of time, he would force her to drink it. And she said after a period of time of being forced to drink it, after a while, it wasn't so forced. It was a way to escape, and I completely understand that. I couldn't imagine what it would be like being with these two sick fucks and them doing all this shit to me. And, if they bring liquor, if that's a way for you to escape what's going on and numb it all, I completely get it. On June 14th of 2002, police are feeling the pressure of not having any leads. The media, this was a national hunt for Elizabeth Smart. I was very young at the time. I was only 12, 13 years old. But I remember everybody talking about this girl. And this was on the West Coast. I'm on the East Coast. This was being talked about everywhere. And I believe that the police were kind of feeling a little bit of pressure from the media and from the world, really, thinking, the police have nothing, all of this time and they have nothing. So on June 14th, 2002, they had asked for a list from Ed Smart of all of the contractors that he had in and out of the home. Now remember, the name he had for Brian Mitchell was Emmanuel. Later, police would actually get his name, and Brian and one other person were the only two to have any type of police record or have any type of arrest record that were the contractors that were actually working at the home of the Smarts. The other one was a man by the name of Richard Reese, and he had actually been arrested 9 days after Elizabeth Smart's abduction for parole violation. A long rap sheet of some really, really high offenses. So the police were like, this is our guy, and they hoed down on him and really truly thought that Richard Reese was the person to abduct Elizabeth Smart. Now, Richard Reese, he stood his ground in the fact that he had nothing to do with Elizabeth Smart's abduction. He even cried in his interrogation over it and said, put yourself in my shoes. Like, this is something that I honestly did not do, and you guys are accusing me of it. However, that would be shortly lived, because shortly after this interrogation, Richard Reese would suffer a brain aneurysm and be life-starred or helicoptered to the hospital, where he underwent brain surgery, and shortly after he would pass away. But Elizabeth Smart's parents, they never let up. They were on the news every chance they could. never giving up on their daughter. They knew that she was still alive. They knew that Richard Reese wasn't the right one. In the meantime, while Elizabeth was abducted, Brian Mitchell and Wanda would be taking Elizabeth actually into town, and he would have Elizabeth and Wanda wearing full robes just like Brian wore, and he would have them wearing like full face garments. I'll include a photo that was actually taken at a house party in Salt Lake City. This is when Brian actually started to get comfortable with what he had done, and he was taking Elizabeth into the city, and there was a house party in the city. And if you watch the Elizabeth Smart documentary, you'll know that the man that is photoed in this picture, he knew that something was off, and he had actually pulled Elizabeth aside at the party and said, you know, if you ever need anything, like, you can tell us, we can help you. But Elizabeth was so scared that, you know, either police wouldn't believe that it was actually her and she would end up back with them, or they would get away with it somehow and she would be hurt and her family would be hurt. So Elizabeth kept her mouth shut. She didn't say a word. One day over the campsite, a helicopter flew over, and Elizabeth said that she just felt like in that moment that someone was going to come down from that helicopter and rescue her. But that unfortunately wouldn't be the case. And shortly after this is when Brian Mitchell said, we have to get out of Salt Lake City. This terrified Elizabeth even more, because she knew at this point, she knew that if they left Salt Lake City, that there was a chance that no one would recognize her if, you know, somebody seen her in town. But what she didn't know is that the whole nation was looking for her. It wasn't just Salt Lake City. But Brian Mitchell ended up going into town for a few days, getting enough money for bus tickets, and Brian, Wanda, and Elizabeth would catch a bus where they would go for Vegas, switch over to another bus, and end up in San Diego. Meanwhile, the media is creating anything that they can. They're claiming that remains have been found. They also claim that there was a sighting of where Elizabeth's beheading happened. All of these things. They even pulled up a inconclusive lie detector test done on her uncle, and the media started to claim that he had something to do with it because his lie detector test was inconclusive. It wasn't that he didn't pass the lie detector test, it was that it was inconclusive, probably because he was upset. You know, the media in these types of situations just try to pull anything they can to try to have the newest bit of information, and it's unfortunate because people start to believe those lies. And it wasn't always easy for the Smart family, but they ended up coming forward and saying, look, if this keeps the people talking about our daughter and keeps the people interested in finding her, then we don't care what they have to say. We just want her found. Another person who would also get involved in this case early on was John Walsh. Now, if you don't know who John Walsh is, then you're probably not a true crime enthusiast. John Walsh is the host of America's Most Wanted. He had gotten in contact with Ed Smart and had told him, like, hey, we can find her. Don't give up. You've got to keep pushing. So the final deciding factor for Brian Mitchell to take Wanda and Elizabeth Smart out of Utah happened in a library in Utah. So they're sitting at a library, and a tip gets called into the police that Elizabeth Smart is at the library. This police officer goes, and I think the important thing to remember is that a lot of the police at this point believe that Reese was the one who, they all believe that he raped and murdered and buried Elizabeth Smart somewhere out in the deserts of Utah. So when he died, a lot of the police figured, we're never going to find her. So I don't think that they were taking this lead very seriously, because when they went, they were wearing their robes and were wearing the shawl, you know, the drapes over their face and everything. And Brian Mitchell was saying, you know, it's part of our religion. The only people that's ever going to see her face is me, her father. He was claiming to be her father, and her future husband. No one else will see her face. And they actually got away with it. That officer ended up walking away and leaving Elizabeth there with Wanda and Brian Mitchell. They go to California for a while. things are the same. Nothing is changing. The only thing that's really changed is that Elizabeth is no longer like tied up anymore. Like he's letting her kind of roam around on her own. And the Smart family isn't stopping. They're continuing to push on. And remember Mary Catherine, the sister who was in the bed with Elizabeth the night she was abducted and ran into her parents' room and said, somebody just took Elizabeth. The police had been very adamant on not pressing Mary Catherine for information, to let her come to them on her own time. Well, Mary Catherine would eventually come to them 4 months after Elizabeth was abducted and said, I know who took Elizabeth. It was Emmanuel. It was that homeless guy in the city that Mom gave $5 to. Well, the police did not take that serious at all. At all. Not the way that they should have. By any means, they did not. And the Smart family did not care. They wanted to find their daughter. So they ended up going to John Walsh and coming up with this composite sketch of Brian Mitchell. The FBI and John Walsh end up releasing this composite sketch. And this would actually carry down the road of actually getting Elizabeth, because Brian Mitchell's ex-brother-in-law and sister would actually call into America's Most Wanted and say, this is my brother. He actually goes by the name Emmanuel. He is absolutely insane. And he has this crazy girlfriend, Wanda, or wife, or whatever she is now. This would then lead to his ex-wife, who he was married to, calling in. Now, Brian Mitchell, he was born into some really shitty circumstances. His dad was a social worker, but was absolutely horrible to him. He would, have him watch porn and all kinds of really weird, nasty shit. And Brian would turn out to be a lot like him. And Brian was also born into a family with 5 brothers and sisters, just like Elizabeth. And I think that that was one of the things that intrigued him to abduct her, because one of the things that he would force Elizabeth to do would be watch porn as well. So he carried a lot of that onto her. Brian's ex-wife would call in to America's Most Wanted and say, yes, this is him. He goes by Emmanuel. He was terrible to my kids, beat my kids, and molested my daughter, and she's suicidal to this day over it. And so this is when things started being guns a-blazing. And so at this point, Wanda, Brian Mitchell, and Elizabeth are in California, and he is talking about going east. He's talking about going to New York or going to Boston, a big city. And Elizabeth is just thinking, because she doesn't know, they've been living in the middle of the woods. She doesn't know how much people are talking about her and how many people are actually looking for her. So she has no idea of that. So she is like, we cannot go out east. If we go out east, I will never go back home to my family. I have to convince him somehow to go back to Salt Lake. So she comes to Brian Mitchell and she's like, look, I feel that God has come to me and told me that we need to go back to Salt Lake. I know he would never actually come to me, but can you ask him if that's where we're supposed to go? And at that point, Brian thought, oh, I've really got her where I want her now. She's really where I needed her to be. She's in this. And then she goes a step further and says, I also feel like, because Brian Mitchell's big thing was that she needed to experience rape in order to appreciate sex. She needed to experience these things in order to appreciate life. So she tells Brian, I think I need to experience hitchhiking. I think I need to experience that. So Brian goes into the city and steals a wig and a pair of glasses and a scarf. And that would be Elizabeth Smart's costume, if you will, until she was actually found. They end up hitchhiking, and part of the way back to Utah, they're on a bus. And on this bus, there is a guy who is questioning Brian Mitchell about Elizabeth. Why is she wearing that wig that's so obviously not her, because they had her in a gray wig. So this guy's like, that's obviously not her hair. Like, is that part of her religion? The very next bus stop, Brian Mitchell gets them off the bus. Like, we're getting off the bus, and they start walking, and they go into a Walmart. And when they're in the Walmart, a woman would recognize Elizabeth Smart and say, "We're calling America's Most Wanted." And that is how everything would unfold. The husband of this woman actually didn't even want to call in, and she said, "You will sleep in the garage for the next month. We're calling America's Most Wanted." They called America's Most Wanted, and Mick Fentry, he was the lead FBI agent on this case. He was one of the FBI agents to release the composite sketch of Brian Mitchell. He would be one of the first contacted that Elizabeth had been sighted in Sandy, Utah. And they're coming out of the Walmart, and Elizabeth said she just remembers coming out of the Walmart and there being so many police cars, like a ton. And originally, when the police would walk up to them, Brian Mitchell would handle the conversation like usual. Elizabeth would stay completely silent, and he would say, "This is part of our religion, blah, 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 blah." And eventually the police would pull Elizabeth away from Brian Mitchell, because at this point Elizabeth was sticking to, "That is not me. That is not me. That is not me." The police pull her maybe 6-7 feet away from Brian Mitchell to ask her. She still stands strong that that's not me. The officer is even holding a picture next to her face saying, "This is you. Like, this is you. But we need you to be the one to say, like, yes, that's me." Denying. And then the female officer who is in the documentary over this pulls Elizabeth into a police car and is like, "Look, this is your last chance to just admit that it's you. Like, just admit it's you. Like, you have a family that are just so worried. Like, it's okay. You're safe. It's over. You do not have to worry about it. It's fine." And she says, "Thou sayest." So at this point, like I said, they were speaking like Bible language at this point. Like, they weren't even really speaking like in terms like you and I speak. So the police and other investigators there on scene all took that as it's Elizabeth. So they take them back to the police department, where Elizabeth would be put in a separate room apart. They all three were put in separate rooms. And if you watch the interrogation of Brian Mitchell, it is the most, I'm not including it because it is literally the most frustrating interrogation to watch. He just talks about stuff that doesn't even, like, they're trying to ask him about the actual crime, and he's talking about the Bible and, making up different parts of the Bible and just all kinds of shit, claiming he's a prophet, he's God's servant, like all this shit. From the get-go, Brian Mitchell was trying to have them know that he was insane and that, I'm pleading insanity. It's basically the picture he was painting from the jump. And there's not really much said on Wanda's interrogation. I think that Wanda was playing the same card, though, because they were both going to be treated for their mental before they were tried. And it would be 8, almost 9 long years after Elizabeth was rescued before they would go to trial, which is crazy. Now, another really important part that I forgot to mention happened on July 24th of 2002. Brian Mitchell had stated that he wanted many wives, and he had actually told Elizabeth that he had chosen his next wife, and this was when they were originally in Utah. He had chosen his next wife, and that it was going to be her cousin. Yes, Lois's sister's daughter. However, when Brian Mitchell would try to sneak through the kitchen window, they had photos sitting on the counter and they were knocked over. And Lois's sister would wake up to that, and she would actually see Brian Mitchell through the window and he would run off. So that was another key factor that was never said. He never tried to get any other wives during her abduction after that, because the 2 times that he tried, he got caught. He tried another time as well with someone else, but that didn't work either. He got caught as well. So he would just run away. He wouldn't be arrested or anything, but like he wouldn't be able to go through with the actual abduction. Like I said, eventually she is found. And on March 12th, 2003, to be exact, she was abducted for 9 months. She is reunited. So like I said, she was taken to this room in the police department. And she said out of nowhere, the doors just burst open and it's her dad. And she says that just hearing him and her talk about it is just so, like, it makes my heart full. He said that he seen her and ran over to him. And she said that she was so scared to really admit that it was her. She was just so scared that either somebody wasn't going to believe her or that Brian Mitchell was going to get away with it yet again. And so she just was really just keeping her mouth shut. And she said when those doors opened and she seen her dad, she finally felt safe enough to admit it. And he ran up and hugged her and, you know, pulled her back and said, is it really you, Elizabeth? And she said, yeah, Dad, it's me. And she said from that moment on, she felt safe. And after she was rescued, the whole country weighed in as normal, their opinions of what should happen with Elizabeth after she was rescued from her abductor. People thought that she should undergo therapy and that she shouldn't really be in society until she underwent like psychotherapy and all these things. But her parents really thought that it was important to let Elizabeth do what Elizabeth wanted to do, because for the past 9 months, Elizabeth hadn't been able to make any of decisions for her own life. So Elizabeth didn't want to go to therapy originally. She said that her parents really were her therapy. When she felt like she needed to talk about something, she would talk about it with her mom and dad. Very early on, Elizabeth was telling her family and police in interrogation, the moment she saw her dad, she let police know every single detail from the night that she was abducted until the day that she was rescued. She let them know every single detail and she did not leave out one single thing. Like I said, it would be 8, almost 9 full years until Elizabeth would finally get justice. But Elizabeth was not standing down. Like I said, Brian Mitchell and Wanda, they both tried to plead incompetent for trial. That's why it took so long for them to actually be able to go to trial and get a verdict on both of them. However, in the end, the judge was over it and said that they were both competent enough to stand a fair trial. And Wanda was sentenced to 10 years. And fun fact, she is already out. Yeah, she's already out. And let me update you this as well. She's also living 600 feet away from a goddamn elementary school. Tell me how in the fuck someone who kidnaps a girl with her husband, okay, had just as much a hand in the whole mess as Brian Mitchell, gets out already. She's already out. Like, update, spoiler alert, it was literally on the news a few years ago. She moved 600 feet across the goddamn street from an elementary school. However, according to her probation and all of the rules she's supposed to follow, I even read it word for word, she is not going against any rule of her probation, which has me wondering, how is that not a fucking rule for someone who has committed a kidnapping and abduction, has been a helping hand in someone committing these crimes? How are they able to move across the street from a goddamn elementary school? Can someone please explain that to me? How is that not a rule? That seems like the most logical fucking rule. That should be like rule number 4. You know what I'm saying? You can't live next to a daycare, a school. Hello? Am I wrong here? I don't think so. Brian Mitchell would play the same shit through court. He would burst out in singings and preachings and all this weird shit. The judge wasn't having it, and he was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and there was finally justice for Elizabeth Smart. Now, telling this story, it would not quite give it justice to not shared the triumph that is Elizabeth Smart after abduction story. After Elizabeth was abducted, she did eventually go into therapy, and she was 15 when she was rescued. Eventually, as an adult, Elizabeth would start the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, where she would speak out and help people who had been raped and kidnapped. She shares her stories through books. She's also a public speaker. Not only that, but also as a young adult, she would eventually go on her missionary trip across seas, where she would meet her husband, and they now have 3 beautiful children as well. She's written multiple books, been on multiple interviews, and you can also follow her on Instagram. That was part of my research as well, is just scrolling through her Instagram, where she shares a lot of details of her abduction through there. She goes through certain spots where she was during her abduction, and she still talks very much about it and shares her story to this day. And I think that that is such a beautiful thing. The amount of people that this girl has helped, and I think any time that there is a horror story like this that ends on such a beautiful miracle of a note, I think that it's just such a fantastic story. And I want to say thank you to you guys for, requesting this one, because I hadn't really researched this one at all. I knew like the basics, but I had no idea that it was to the extent that it was, and that the police literally had walked up to her before and left her with this man. No wonder she wasn't like, it's me, which I also want to talk about, because this is the biggest thing that she's been criticized over, is why did you not tell the police officer in the library that it was you? Why did you not tell the guy at the house party in Utah that it was you? Why did you not tell the police immediately when they walked up to you outside Walmart that it was you? Why didn't you try to run? Why didn't you scream? Why? I think that it's important that we remember, number one, she was a 14-year-old girl. I do believe she had the ideal childhood, which probably means that she was a little bit sheltered and probably didn't really know how ugly the world really was until that dark night that she was abducted, and those 9 months that she was, abused and raped and all of those horrific things. And I think that she was terrified. You have to remember, this man was repeatedly beating into her ear, number one, God sent me here. God told me to do this. And number two, if you do anything, if you make a peep, if you tell anyone, if you do anything other than what I'm telling you to do, I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to kill your whole family, because I've gotten away with it every time. And he was right. Hell, even during her abduction, there's even a time where he goes down into town to minister, which is what he called going down to Panhandle. He's down in town ministering, and he's gone for days, bitch. And Wanda and Elizabeth are back at the campsite starving. They went 3 days with no food or water. Elizabeth said she remembers eventually starting to hallucinate, and she's laying on the ground, and she's like, oh my God, if I die now, I've made it through this damn abduction and all of this, and I die because I starved, I hope I have a sense of humor in my next life. Like, I hope I have a sense of humor. And she says, out of nowhere, as soon as she thinks this, it starts to downpour, and her and Wanda jump up. They end up getting stuff to hold water, and that is what would save them. And then she said before she knew it, her and Wanda hear singing coming from the distance, out of tune, just all over the place. And it's Brian Mitchell. This motherfucker had been arrested. Y'all, you can't make this up. And keep in mind, this was like weeks before Elizabeth was rescued. This is like a month before she was rescued. Like, what the fuck? He was arrested in California. Yeah. Even had to go back to court, where he would then tell the judge, oh, well, because he broke into a church, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that, but he broke into a church. And he tells the judge, like, I will never do it again. I hadn't drank in 23 years. And I got drunk that night and broke into the church. But you don't have to worry about that no more, because I don't drink no more. And the judge let him off. So you have to understand, repeatedly, police are walking up to them. He's even getting arrested and getting set free. So she's like, I'm not getting out of this situation. I've got to pick the right moment where he and Wanda are not around before I say, I am Elizabeth Smart. This is me. Please help. And she did. She picked the right moment. She was in the back of a police car with a woman officer. She felt comfortable. And while she didn't say, yes, I'm Elizabeth Smart, she said, thou sayest. You know, you have to understand, I'm sure that there was an intense amount of brainwashing during the 9 months that she was captivated. Again, I thank you guys so much for recommending the story of Elizabeth Smart. I will have her Instagram linked below along with her book. I did read it for this video and I highly recommend it. It's an incredible autobiography, and it will be linked down in the description box as well. I love you guys so much. Thank you guys for hanging out with me today. Again, if you would like to recommend a story for True Crime Thursdays, it's first come, first serve, but you can email questionsforshay@gmail.com, and whichever one comes first, that's the one we're doing. Thank you all for hanging out with me today. Remember to be kind and be safe, and until the very next time, bye guys.